All right, we're back. It's COMP391, and it's week 1, lesson 1, part 4. Part 4. We did 1, 2, 3 last week, our last day, and this day we're going to do, this is day 2, we're going to do part 4 of this video series for lesson 1. So last time we did a brief talk about the arcade industry, or the history of the game industry. We're going to continue that a little bit for the first hour or so. That'll give you a chance to download and install Blender if you need to. And then we're going to get into more about Blender, right? So we did a little bit about Blender. We'll do a little bit of recap. For those people, I think everyone got your the shortcut key handout except for Vanessa, because Vanessa was away for some reason. Vanessa didn't like me as much as the other people, so she decided to stay clear, right? For one day. Vanessa, there you go. And then anyone else not get that, the handout? I think most everyone was here last time, so you should have the handout. So we're going to just use that again. It's just a quick cheat sheet. Hopefully by the end of this session, you guys will not need it anymore, right? You'll be able to remember the Blender shortcuts and all that stuff. That's part of what you need to do as a developer sometimes. You need to remember the shortcut keys. We know them as well, like Control-C, Control-X, and Control-V for Microsoft products, or even most Mac products. It's just instead of Control, it's Command for Mac, right? But at the end of the day, we know the shortcut keys because it's a fast way of improving our workflow. So it'll be the same here. I know there might be, just to open up like this, there might be a little bit of fear. I'll put it out there like that, where when you say stuff like, oh, there's a lot of controls. Blender is crazy. To learn Blender it's really intense, right? And it can be scary because you've seen Blender's a crazy interface, right? But I can assure you that by the end, you'll be fine, right? So bear with me, be patient. I'd ask you to do that right now because you haven't seen a lot of it yet. So it might seem a little overwhelming at first. And I gave you the treatment on Wednesday. I didn't mean to scare you away. I just kind of said, hey, look, this is the Blender interface. We're going to be doing Blender alongside this stuff here, the history, and some other theory pieces. Okay, so just bear with me, like I said. Otherwise, you won't get the understanding that you need. Okay, so today we're talking about a little bit more about the history, and then we're going to hopefully I can get into this idea of platforms, different platforms. We won't finish platforms. It'll probably spill off a little bit into next week, and then I'd like to talk about the player, a little bit more about player concepts. All right, so we're at the arcade, and then the arcade was starting to die off, in terms of around 1980, in the 80s, at one point, there was actually a slump. So you're in the arcade, you're physically playing a game in the arcade, and again, I remember these days when I used to do that. And then console games really start coming off. Now, it started pretty early with Magnavox, but Magnavox wasn't a console game. It was like a very simple electronic machine, more than anything else. It did a few things for you, but it really didn't. It wasn't really the games that we know today, right? Now they ramped up as slowly over the years, and they've kind of gone from something much more electronic and more into a computer, right? And we'll talk about that. Like today's Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and Wii U, latest ones, I would say. You're looking at a 8-core processor for both the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, right? That's a decent processor that you're dealing with both the systems having about 8 gigs of RAM and about 500 gig hard drive, approximately. That's a computer to me, right? That's like what it is, right? And before, it was like these little beep, beep, kind of electronic devices that we called consoles. So they've gone a long way. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we move forward. I remember the Atari 2600. It was a very, very simple system. It was cartridge-based, right? And I'm just going to kind of put this a little bigger for you guys so you guys can see it a little better. Let me just move this aside. Again, a cartridge-based system. You had these controllers and these 2 paddles, right? And this controller usually had more than one. It was a multiplayer console, but as you can see, there's these switches, right, to turn the thing off and on, right? And this hooked up to your television, right? So at the time, and I say television as in what it is, not an LCD. Didn't have that kind of technology back then in the day. It was a fat, ugly, electron gun television that if you stared at long enough, your parents would say, "What are you doing? You lose your eyes. Radiation's gonna kill you." Like that kind of stuff. Because that's what it was back then. It was literally like electron gun in your eye, right? and I don't know, maybe that's why when I was, in my 30s, my eyes were gone, right? I mean, then again, I spent a lot of time, not just, red-eyed playing video games, but also doing reading in university and stuff, right? But at the end of the day, we did a lot of game playing, and the TV was literally like this. So this big ass, electron gun going bang, 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 bang right into the eyeball, right? We were playing this stuff, and I remember playing Yar's Revenge way back in the day. This is going back, and I was like a little guy, right? I mean, 1976 for me, I'm still quite young, right? Now, but this stuff lasted until, I would say, the 1980s, when we had very, very simple systems. I never owned an Atari 2600, but I always had this guy, right? There's a guy in the corner. That's what we always used to call him. And he would be the guy that would have all the electronics, right? He'd go there. He was rich. I don't know why. He would have like a real ass, arcade game inside his basement, right? And so we would go to his house and we'd play this stuff if we had to. But most of the time we would be in the arcade. But when this guy got this Atari 2600, it was just like, video game day at his house as many times as possible until we got kicked out, right? So, and this is what we would take turns on this thing. I think we had more fights about who's going to take turns next than anything else, being the young guys that we were. And I know his parents wanted us out of the house as fast as possible to go play sports outside. What's wrong with you guys? It's 30 degrees outside. We didn't care. So that, what? It wasn't just us. The reason why I'm saying this stuff, to frame it for you, was that's how excited we were about playing a console, right? It was a different time. It was a time, like I said before, like last time, when there were no cell phones, there were no fax machines, or these kind of things we see today. And the theater was probably the best time in terms of entertainment. We couldn't. I mean, TV only had about 30 channels, right, back then, and that kind of thing. I know I'm saying back in the day, but truly that's what it was for us. So I came from that generation, and there's different things that you learn when you're in that limited, kind of technology society kind of stuff compared to now. You guys have a different set of learning that you're going to have, and you're going to pass on the same things to your kids when you guys talk to them, right? You're going to say to your kids something like this, or people, maybe if you don't have kids, people later on that you're going to say something like this. Hey, when I was a kid, right, we didn't have this holographic technology that you guys have today, right? That's what you're going to say to them, something like that. Or we don't have the eye implants that you have today, or whatever. We don't have the genetic manipulation that whatever, I mean, you're going to say something like the same thing that we say today, because every generation does the same thing. I grew up in a garbage pail, one of those kind of things, right? And so it's the same thing with us here. We're going to, this is what I'm telling you, but this is how these video games grew up. I remember what they did. A lot of times, as you're going to see, classic games like cards, especially things like chess, all those kind of things. There was just this need to put this stuff on the computer, and simple games like that you might say, wow, okay, who cares about cards? People were dying to play this stuff before because they didn't have such a thing. This is funny. This is the first Easter egg way back in the day. They actually put it into this, around the same time into an Atari. This designer put this Easter egg in for the very first time, right? Again, these Easter eggs now, they appear in videos, DVD. Well, when we used to watch DVDs, now of course it's all streaming, right? We're streaming video and downloads, Netflix. But before, Easter eggs were like, a lot of designers would start putting them into their games, and it was kind of fun to find the Easter eggs. Actually, it was a joke among all us guys. We would know a lot of the Easter eggs inside of a lot of these games, and it actually increased this whole pop culture of being a nerd, right? Being a nerd was like, was big, right? But it was, I mean, it's way bigger now than it was before. Before, it was like we were all closet nerds, right? Playing video games. Like we couldn't come out in the open and say, I'm a nerd and I love it. I play D&D. We couldn't do that kind of stuff, right? Because if you play D&D, then, going out with having a social life is just not possible back then, right? You would just be like, looked down upon. But then again, there was a lot more racism and cultural kind of adversity, I would say, back then than there is now. Now there's, let me take that back. It was different, right? There's still lots of cultural adversity and racism. But before, it was just like, I guess, more accepted. If you got beat up on, then you got beat up on. Nowadays, you go to school, and just as kind of a comparison, being a bully, it's not tolerated. Back then, bullies were just a fact of life. You got beat up in the yard because you made somebody mad. Well, you got to watch out, right? Now, you got beat up in the yard. What are you talking about? Let's get that guy to jail, right? We can't allow that to happen. We got to tell his parents and ask them and get them involved, you know? So it's the same kind of thing for this kind of stuff. Being a nerd and being involved in pop culture, even involved in things like playing video games, even developing video games, it was you know, you were looked at in a different light than you are today. Today, playing video games is a fact of life. Today, when we go home, like I said before, we kind of relax. A lot of us have video games. A lot of us are gamers and all that kind of stuff, and it's an accepted kind of fact. Before, not so, right? I remember the Intellivision. I remember playing it. It was a really clunky machine, right? Compared to the Atari, it was a bit of a step up from the Atari 2600, that whole series of consoles. I never had it. A friend of mine, we always there's another. It was always a competition. Me and my friend. I would have the Atari 2600 as an example. He'd have the Intellivision. I mean, I never had the Atari, but it was just always that kind of competition. And he was the first one that got it. And they offered every system almost like tried to outdo the next one, Similarly, how we do it now. I mean, if you have the Xbox, and then you have the PS4 as an example, Xbox One, PS4. They're trying to outdo each other, right, all the time. Every single version of the consoles that come out today, or game machines, if you will, they come up with new stuff, right? So this is one that came up with, it was kind of a different kind of controller. The controller almost looked like a numpad, right? Where you just you have, but with a bit of a dial in the middle. Like literally that dial, this thing right here, you could dial for directions in 8 different directions. It's almost like a little paddle kind of thing. Remember, going back to the 2600, right? The 2600 had these 2 paddles where you can play Pong, and that was one of the biggest games back then, right? So from a human interface perspective, like remember, we have different interfaces now than we had before, right? We have a 3-button mouse, right? We have specialized mice you can buy from like Best Buy or wherever it's going to be, or order online, right? Special gamer mouses and all, mice. And where today, I mean, back then, we didn't have such things. Are you kidding me? There was no mice. So, and finally we went into these handhelds. Well, back in the day, handhelds. Literally, they were a bit smaller than my little numpad that I'm holding here in my hand. That's one thing you saw, and they were LED type handhelds. Like literally, I played the football one, which is the one on the left. This is like literally, I had this one, and it was just an electronic device, right? I remember it was the longest trip I had, going all the way to New York from Toronto on New Year's one time, and I was just playing this game nonstop. My father had to swat me in the head just a couple times, right? Stop that, right? Because it was unacceptable back then to do that kind of stuff. You know, if you had a game, people were awed. First of all, if you had one of these games, it was the latest craze. Every kid had to have a handheld device like this, right? And you might say, who cares, handheld devices? And mostly it was guys, right? Most guys had it. Girls would be like, that's a guy thing. I don't want that, right? It wasn't a thing to do. And even today, I'm gonna say that again and again, but it's unfortunate that we don't have enough women in our industry. We just do not, right? We have to have more and more, in my opinion, that's a component we're missing of. It's still, I don't know if you want, it's a disparaging difference between the number of women in energy compared to the number of men. So we have to kind of improve that somehow, or maybe make games and the way we design things a little bit differently. Anyway, so we had all these different kinds of games, and it was handhelds like this, but they were so primitive. Like if you played the game today, you'd be like, come on, are you kidding me? I can make this in my sleep. You guys, programmers, you guys probably can create this today with a console. Like that's how simple these things are. Like literally this game here, right, this football game, you had a guy, he was a blip, okay, that's all it was, a line, right? That's the guy, right? And you would kind of charge out and move with these keys, right? You would kind of move forward with these ones or back, up and down with these controls, and literally move the blip across the screen until it got to the other side, right? And then you could actually score. You could get a ball, and there's a little electronic ball that would move around, like literally animate the LEDs on the screen, this little tiny screen, like about this big. And that was exciting. That was awesome, right? Same thing with the sub game. The sub game and there's other games that were out there that you could play. Bowling, oh my God, that was really boring. The face was a little bit different. It looked like the bowling pins on the end. They were pre-drawn, right? And then you just press the button and you would move the ball down. When you shot the ball, it would just go into its path, right? A bowling ball. So it was simple, but it kind of was a precursor to what we have today with, example, the 3DS, kind of more recent kind of handheld that we have today. We're going to talk about that. Finally, we got to the ColecoVision. again, a cartridge-based game, similar to what we had in the Atari 2600, right? But a little bit more advanced. Graphics were slightly better, and that's what they kept on doing. Each version of the game, as we move forward, they had a few different kinds of games. Like this one, Space Fury was a big one. I know Donkey Kong, it moved on from the Atari 2600, and they actually brought it out as a game there too. And the joystick, again, was interesting because compared to the Intellivision, so let's go back to Intellivision with this one, see this joystick. This is almost like the predecessor where you had a joystick that you would literally move around, almost like a pad. That's what it was, the first time we had any kind of pad, compared to this one, which actually had a little bit of a little joystick, a tiny little joystick with a number pad. And there's all these inserts that you can get for this thing. So if you're playing a shooting game, you could actually put a different kind of insert on top of this thing for the shooting game, or some kind of jumping game, like an insert that would go kind of on top, because we didn't have anything else back then. Cartridges were really clunky, and they were actually daughter boards that would go on top of the motherboard of the device. So here, if this is the device, you'd have a motherboard that ran this way, right? And the daughter board, which is the cartridge, would slip into the device, and you'd have to turn the device off for the daughter board or cartridge to activate, right, and on. And once that does, it would load up the game. So all these games are being what we call ROMs. We're going to look at some of those ROMs today. You can actually download, if you want to really play some of these old games I talked about last time, take a look at this. Actually, I'll take you to the site right now so you can see what I'm talking about. There's actually, you can go to download something called MAME, right, which is multiple arcade machine emulator. You can actually download for both PC and Mac. And what MAME is, it's even supported on Linux these days. You can actually download MAME, and then you can download the ROMs, a bunch of these ROMs that came with the cartridges back in the day, to play some of these old games. And there's a lot of them out there right now. So if you wanted to try it out, and I'll show you how it looks later on, MAME is the place to go. So any kind of old games like Pac-Man, Space Invaders, any of that kind of stuff, you can go to MAME, download it, install it on your machine, and try it out, right? In fact, a lot of times what I do with my students, I say, look, take a look at these old games, play them, right? Take a look at one of these old games, and then if we're going to emulate it in 2D, can you try and make something similar? Try and make a clone of blah blah, right? And you'll see it's not easy, right? There's a lot of little things, even today with today's technology, that they used to do before. That it's hard to kind of completely emulate today. It's making a game, any game, 2D, 3D, takes a long time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. At least anything that's effective and that you're proud of. You can make a pretty chintzy game in about an hour, right? But it's you may not be very proud of it at the end. Although, you know what? There are some people hit the jackpot with some of these things that they make. Very simple games like Flappy Bird. Come on, that's just I don't even know how it came out to be so popular. It's like one of the most challenging games to play because you just die every time, the pillars go by, right? So, but I know my kids are all into that still, even though it's been banned and come back a couple times. Oh yeah, it got banned from the Apple Store. You couldn't download it anymore, right? They actually got removed and then put back, and all kinds of other stuff like that. There was a time where they were actually trying to sell Flappy Bird for all kinds of money on eBay if you had it. Was that? Yeah, they probably did, but it was. The guy who made it, he was getting all kinds of stuff, and then he doesn't want to do. He doesn't want to be part of the industry. Meanwhile, he's like a little millionaire, right? Because it's crazy. Think about that. That's insane. And what did he do? He made this little game, and I'm talking about a side scroller, guys. That is the stupidest side scroller. We could make this in an hour if we sat down and do it, right? A Flappy Bird clone. Okay, maybe not an hour, but let's say a day. We sit down in a day. If we concentrated, get the assets together, right? Literally, you can put this thing in a day together, no problem, right? We've done it in class. Let me put it that way, okay? A Flappy Bird clone, we can do in a day. All right, and a total web-based one, which is even easier to do than the one he did. So we kind of had this slump happen, and where it was really, really challenging. And a lot of these things, they really forced, these, because there's so many different kinds of consoles. It's almost like, you watch TV and there's a billion shows on TV nowadays, right? And now, I'll be honest with you, I don't even watch regular TV because I hate commercials, right? I'm one of those guys, right? And same thing with the radio. It's hard for me to listen to a radio because of the commercials. The DJs just drive me crazy, right? Well, it's the same thing. With these things, there's so many game systems at the time. They were all competing with each other. Literally, they had to bring down their cartridges, which were, you know, pretty expensive to make at the time, because even if you made them in the factory, I mean, there was not a lot of profit margin there. It's like $5, right? And then it became almost like you couldn't get a good console that you know, that worked properly and all this kind of stuff without, you know, really, you know, dropping the price so people would buy it. I mean, it was a big thing. Imagine how it is now at Christmas, where you go shopping at Christmas and everyone's buying stuff. Back then, the big Christmas items for kids were these consoles, right? I guess they're kind of the big ticket items now too, if you want to buy kids games. But today, games cost like, you know, brand new game, Xbox or PS4 or whatever, probably cost in the $50 to $60 range, right? Or $70 range. Some of them are really, really expensive, and $65. And then they drop, right? So for the first few months, you know, or first year or so, they're like in the $65 range, and then they drop down to like, you know, $39, and finally they're in the bargain bin for like $20, right? And maybe $5. And if you go to any of those places that trade in your games, and I'm not going to mention them, who they are here, just because we're on YouTube. But if you go there and if you trade in your games or whatever, you can even get discounts for the games you trade in and take it off brand new games. So to me, that's kind of a new thing that came out later on as we approached, you know, the year 2000 and so on. But back in the day, there was no such thing. When you had these old cartridges lying around, you know what you can do with them if you changed consoles? Throw them out, or try and sell them in a garage sale. That's probably what all you could do, because none of them were compatible with any other ones. So again, 1985, that was back in the day. I remember 1985, the year that Back to the Future came out with Michael J. Fox. That was back in the day. I remember these days because I went to the movie, right? I actually was alive back then, yeah. I know, I'm an old guy, right? But anyways, they came out with all kinds of awesome systems starting off at that time. And they had better graphics, better sound. You know, we're almost getting into the realm of 16-bit. They were all still 8-bit games though, until probably in the 90s when we hit the 16-bit versions of all the games. And you might say 16-bit, dude, that's like we're into the 64-bit now, right? True, true. That's all very, very true. But back then, 8-bit was huge, right? And that's why they came up with all these 8-bit games. They came out with the Game Boy, right? And that was, again, it was crazy. The Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance. I remember, again, it was one of those competitive things. What? I got my ColecoVision, and my buddy, he had the Game Boy, right? And we just kept on. It was one of the things we would do every couple of years. We'd change up our machines, right? And this is what they look like. Here's your Game Boy. He had it handheld like this. He would take that to school. Meanwhile, this, I'll tell you, this was the standard game system that we had. We would play, and we had like cartridges and cartridges and cartridges of this stuff that we play. I'm not a big Mario fan at all. Just I never was, right? It wasn't something that I enjoyed. I never understood people that were into it, right? But there's a lot of other kind of games that Nintendo had as well, and so we were all totally into this thing. Again, there was no you plug this into your monitor or your TV, your television with an electron gun, right? That we talked about before. There was no flat screen at the time. Around this time, 1985 was the precursor, just before really mainstream mobile phones were going to come out. The function phones we're talking about back in the day. If you had it in 1985, it was like a brick. That's what these things look like. Like literally, they were like massive. They're bigger than this, like this, brick, right? Some people had phones in their car. All right, where literally, just to give you an idea of technology at the time, where the phone in the car would literally be like almost like the same place you put your handbrake, because some people had the handbrake over here at the time, cars. You'd have a phone that was like literally a brick, and when you took that out, man, you were the coolest guy ever, right, or girl, right? Because you had like this big, massive phone. I don't have anything that big. Like it was almost, and people on watching the YouTube video can't understand, but it was like literally like this. I'm not joking around. That's how almost as big the phone was, like this big, like my lunchbox over here. So you can imagine that's the kind of technology. You know, as we go forward, right? Micro technology, microelectronics, right, got better and better. They made chips smaller and smaller, right? And so this was like a marvel of its time. For you to have a machine, like a little game machine like this that was 8-bit, right, was huge. And something like this, like a handheld, that was probably 4-bit, right? With a little bit of memory and stuff like this, for us at the time, it was a huge revolution, playing a Game Boy. But it quickly kind of, you know, it lost its luster. Game Boy, you'd actually have Game Boy cartridges as well, right? So there was Game Boy cartridges, there was Nintendo cartridges, And between the two, I think there was a compatibility. You could actually have played the Game Boy and the Nintendo or something like that. I think there was some kind of a way of doing that. Sega was the next big one, and it was, again, if you look at when we entered 1990, that's when really the 16-bit market hit, and that's when you think the IBM PC, by the way, it was called IBM PC at the time, was kind of the most common one, and they came out with something we called clones at the time, a clone, PC clone, right? What do you have? I have a PC clone at home, right? And that's what it was called. It wasn't called the PC until kind of late in the 90s, right? Where there's different kinds of PCs. I remember back in the day when I was building my own like PCs, because I was a computer guy for forever and ever, right? You can go to the store and shop around for PC parts, and you can actually build a PC cheaper than you bought it from IBM, Dell, or one of those big chip makers, HP, whatever, right? Nowadays, not the case. If you go today to something like a Tiger Direct, the ones that are still open, or you try and shop online, right, and grab your latest motherboard and video card or whatever, and try and piece part together something, it might cost you more money than if you just buy a kind of a bare bones system, right, from HP, Dell, or IBM. It's kind of the other way around, right? And the reason for that, especially from Costco, if you go to Costco, you can get stupid deals, right? And if you don't like it, you can return it, right? Which is totally weird. We didn't have that kind of thing back in the day. Now you have that, and the thing is, so again, you got to think about PC hardware back then. PC hardware back in the 90s, to give you an idea of capabilities of machines, right? PC hardware had, if you had 2 megs of memory, you were good. 2 megs of memory, all right? If you had a system that was 16-bit, right, and it had 25 megahertz, you were fast, right? 25 megahertz, okay, not gigahertz or whatever. It's like really, really slow, all right? And if you had a hard drive at all, right, back then, it might be 25 megabytes, right, maybe if you're lucky, right? And 25 megabyte hard drive would be bigger than my lunchbox, right? The hard drive literally would be like this, my lunchbox, and another bit like this. That's how big the hard drive was, and this thick, okay? It was a brick like back then. So your system, literally, your tower was required to be that big because you needed the space, right? And there were no the IDE hard drives they had at the time for people who are hardware guys or hardware girls. They were massive, right? SCSI technology was the fastest you can get, and if you could get 3,000 RPM out of your hard drive, you're good to go. All right, that's how slow we're talking about. So really, the bottleneck. There's so many little bottlenecks to slow things down. So again, coming up with a 16-bit machine for gaming was unheard of. It was something that was like, how is Sega doing it? They're putting parts together specifically for gaming. So it was a really big revolution. I can't tell you enough how Sega, especially with CDs that were 32 times CDs, putting a CD was revolutionary, right? One thing that came out around the same time was this whole idea about game violence again, right? As we played more and more first-person shooter games, game violence became a real issue, a conversation that people had in the media. Oh, these gamers, these nerds, now they're playing these first-person shooter games, these sniper kind of games, and they're killing people, and it's not good for the kids. It's terrible for the kids. We should take these games off the market, right? And I guess in the U.S., they kind of came out with, especially in the mid-'90s, they came out with this ESRB rating, and it's kind of something huge. And if you're going to be a game developer nowadays, you need to know about these ESRB ratings. And you can actually go and see all of them. All the ones that you see down here are at esrb.org. And additional to that, there's also some other ones that deal strictly with mobile. Right? Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if we go to esrb.com or .org, let's make this a little bit bigger for you guys so you can see. Right? These ratings, look what they have here. They also have, so they have these ratings, plus they have these ones here, right, for mobile. And if you actually wanted to look at the ESRB ratings, here's the rating guide, right? Yep. Are you saying hi, or are you just putting your hand up to stretch? Stretching. So again, some of these ones, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail as we go. EC for early childhood, everyone 10 plus, teen. So they actually, there's a requirement in the States as well as Canada to kind of rate your games now, because you might, imagine a kid going, "Daddy, I want that, Daddy. It looks like a good game, Daddy." Meanwhile, there's like death, blood, and sex in the game, right? That's not good, right? So that's why it's important for us to have this kind of stuff, these ratings on the games. Almost like watching a movie nowadays. And let's face it, there's cutscenes nowadays that actually show death, blood, and sex in video games, right? GTA 5. So, you know, I'm just saying, right? And let's take a look at that one. That's been really like, you know, like in the news, they hammer that one, eh? They're like, oh, GTA 5 is bad. It's you know, violence against women. We should ban it. There's all kinds of rape and destruction in that. Like, it's been around forever, guys, right? Rape and destruction has been in video games since, like, you know, Duke Nukem, right? So let's go for, so here we have mature. And so a lot of games nowadays, if you notice, all the good games are all rated mature, right? Rated M for mature, right? You see that, you hear that all the time in your commercial, right? If you watch the commercials. And they talk about different content descriptors. This is kind of neat to look at. Alcohol reference to and/or images of alcohol beverages, right? That's bad, right? Animated blood, right? You can't have animated blood. I like this. Blood, depictions of blood and gore, right? And you can read the list. It's quite funny, actually, right? But the idea here is you want to kind of capture which audience the game is appropriate for. That's the idea here, right? Here's an interesting one that they've added quite lately, actually. If you look at the interactive elements, for example, shares info. This is something that's starting to be required more and more in video games. Let's see if I can go up a little bigger for you guys to see this. Shares info, right? So where your game shares info, user info, that's really, really important because now privacy has become a real an issue, a challenge, right? Shares location, right? Because, you know, maybe you don't want people to know where you are, right? Where you physically sit today, right? You don't want them to know. And maybe another one that says users interact, which means, hey, you know, you're playing a video game and all of a sudden, boom, hey, someone else is on the video game with you, right? So these are kind of things that with the, as we embrace things like online and mobile, these things are becoming awesome. Thank you, Vanessa, for that. Or is it Vanessa or is that our visitor, May? Was it you? Come on. She's pointing at you. All right, let's go. Anyway, at the end of the day, I think what we can learn from the ESRB rating in general is that, you know, we've come almost to a maturity with some of these video games, the idea of video games. So I'll make this a little larger. You know, when it comes to understanding how video games have an effect on our culture. I mean, you know, you got to think about it. Art reflects life, reflects art, right? Kind of thing, back and forth. And it's almost like our video games, for us, talk about our society. And funny thing enough, I know this is kind of a different topic altogether, but there is there's quite a bit of violence. Like almost like you make your first video game. The first game you make is first-person shooter, right? You want to make a shooter game to kill people, right? It comes down to this. Maybe in the future, that's not how we're going to think, right? Just like, think about you have a kid today. Okay, I know you guys are kids, but what's the average age? Give me put your hand. How old are you? How old are you? 26. How much? Oh, brother, you could be my kid, no problem, right? You can almost be my kid, right? How about Vanessa? How old are you? 20. 19. So you guys are all like in that big range. Anyone older than 26? How old are you? 27. All right. Well, I'm 46, and I have kids. You know what? One day, 20 years from now, you might have a kid too, right? And they're gonna ask. I know it's crazy, eh? You have 2 kids? Yeah. All right. Cool. Okay, so take a gun and put like a little toy gun. How do you feel about taking a gun and putting it into your kid's hands, right? You're okay with it? Some people are really crazy about that, eh? I won't put my kid, I'm against it. It's really weird. And when I was young, give me the Nerf gun, man. Give me a sword to kill my brother, all right? I wanted to kill him, right? But today, you know, it's a different thing. And what I'm saying to you is everyone has a different mentality around that, especially with gun violence in the States and all that kind of stuff. So I'm bringing it up because we play around with games and stuff like that, and it's something that might change as we go forward. We might start thinking about things a little differently, saying the toys we give our kids today is how they think, what they think is okay for tomorrow, right? And again, this isn't a psychology class, so I'm not going to talk too much more about that. But because I love playing first-person shooters too and killing the guy with, you know, as a sniper myself, right? But it's not because it's the right thing to do. That might be something we change over time, and maybe something we should change over time because we learn. We give. It's almost like if I give a kid a gun today, maybe he'll have a real one tomorrow, right? I think the PlayStation was revolutionary as well. 1995, again, this is when computers were starting to be like on the mainstream. Like literally, you could build your own, no problem, around 1995. motherboards and all that kind of stuff. You can even, a lot of people started having home networks in 1995. Literally, you could have. I mean, it was very simple. The network interface card, NIC cards at the time, was an add-on. It was a daughter board that goes on top of your motherboard. Not a lot of motherboards had, from a computer perspective, had built-in NIC cards, unless you were talking about something that's server grade. Okay, back then. Nowadays, you buy a computer, it has a NIC card, it has a video card, it has everything built in. Back then, having something built in, like an onboard video card on your machine, we looked, all of us as gamers and building gaming rigs back in the day, we looked down upon it. We're like, "Dove, that's crazy. Why would you want? That's the worst. That's like 8-bit graphics. Why would you want that on your video card? No, man. Disable it in the BIOS and drop in a video card. Right? That's way better. And you could do that for a very cheap price of $150. Right? That's how much it was. Right? And then we're talking about a video card that had 2 megs of RAM. Right? So that was like huge. 2 megs of RAM. Well, you got a video card with RAM, a GPU? Yeah, man. You can play the latest Duke Nukem. So the Sony PlayStation had all that and more, and it was made for you at an affordable price too, about $400 or $500 back in the day. It's very similar to what it has today, actually, in terms of cost. Actually, the prices of consoles hasn't changed since 1995. They started off there about $500. Yeah.
I actually just checked earlier. It said it was $299. So it was still a bit cheaper.
Right. Before, when it first came out, $299. I don't know. That's the States money, States price.
Oh.
The Canadian price was not $299, right? The Canadian price was always more, at least about $100 more than the U.S. price. So $399, $499. But anyways, even so, that's not including any games, right? And then when they came bundled after a year or two, just like they do now with a couple games that you can get, right? And the PlayStation looked just like this, but it was the first one that had this kind of controller. And actually, the Xbox almost copied it identically. Like if you actually look at the Microsoft controllers now, they almost kind of look like this, but just spacier, right? And the same thing with the new PlayStation controllers. They kind of look just like this, but PlayStation was the first one to come up with this shape of controller, right? So it's interesting. Again, the big three are the same big three from then that they are now, right? Big three, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony are still the real big three right now. Nintendo being, of course, the one that's the lowest, right? It's kind of the home console for kids. If you want to give your kids a home console, you're going to give them a Nintendo, right? Why? Because there's less killing, right? Seriously. And there's more fun little kid games that you can play on a Nintendo that just don't exist on the PlayStation or Xbox. And that's what they looked like back then. The Xbox, I remember having one of these, right? The Xbox with the green thing on the top, and you notice, look at the controller back then. So they almost mimicked the PlayStation. The PlayStation 2 was revolutionary. PlayStation 1 was awesome. PlayStation 2 was undoable. You couldn't beat the PlayStation 2. In fact, there was this big argument that for many years between GameCube and PlayStation 2, they outdid the Xbox like forever, right? The traditional Xbox couldn't compete with these two systems, especially the GameCube. GameCube for the amount of money that it cost was the way to go, right? We talked about the computer revolution. Again, remember back in the day when I was 10, right? Computers had 4K of RAM, right? And so as they move forward, the Commodore 64, which was probably, I'm going to move on from the Colossal Cave, because this is, by the way, this Colossal Cave thing was where you actually had text-based adventures, right? And actually in my course in COMP100, when you guys did COMP100, you didn't have me, but in my course I made you build a console application, this text-based adventure. I made you build it with methods, right? So you have a method, and you go from one place to the other, and then we built this kind of game because you need to understand the beginnings of games in order for you to get there. Apple II, again, huge revolution. Why? It had a hard drive. No other computer back then had a hard drive, guys. Especially not the IBM. If you bought a hard drive back then, it was massive. It was literally a second thing. It was a secondary thing. Computers back then looked more like typewriters. If you notice, look at the shape of this thing. Like literally looks like a typewriter with a little screen on top, right? And again, it had its own monitor. That's one thing the computer had different than a console at the time. And a monitor had just as good, if not better, graphics than a computer screen, a TV screen. It still had the electron gun, by the way, so it's still going to kill you. But a lot of the monitors, because they were higher resolution in some ways, had either green monitor or an orange monitor you can get at the time. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you can get a white monitor, like white text, right? But the majority of them were either green or orange. Literally, there was no color, right? So we're kind of going back. The Commodore 64 was the first full color monitor. They came out with the VIC-20 originally. That was before. It was 20K of RAM. 20K, guys. Not even a kilobyte we're talking about, not even a meg. Then the Commodore 64 came out with 64K of RAM. And you know what? I cannot tell you the fun we had with our Commodore 64. It had both tape drive, and this is what the hard drive would look like on the right-hand side over here, and a detachable keyboard. So it wasn't like the Apple IIe that had the keyboard and the monitor almost attached. The Apple Mac, in fact, if anything, if you look at the Macintosh, is what they were called, right? It was all one. It was always all one. And one of the biggest problems we had as gamers, as kids, was, man, that Apple, that's proprietary crap. We don't want that anymore, right? We'd always try and go with something like this. It was also proprietary, but at least it was something that kids could afford. I remember I had my couple of versions of Commodore, the C64, the Commodore 64, and then finally we moved into the Amiga, right? Which was an amazing 16-bit machine that you couldn't match back then. Of course, Amiga and Commodore and that whole era died, and you don't have any Commodore machines anymore. And then we had IBM and we had CBM. CBM was Commodore Business Machines, and it existed back then. And we were really, really hoping that the Commodore Business Machine or something like a Commodore 64 would be in our school. Of course, it never happened for us. Huge game machine, and we used floppy disks. Those 5 1/4 floppy disks. That was actually our medium for playing games back then that you could buy. So imagine you buy you buy your game. It comes in a package. To play your game, Jumpman, all right, as an example, you had 5 floppy disks, and then when it came to a certain level, you had to swap out the floppy disk for another one. Like literally take out the disk, and it was like this big, 5 1/4. And you just like take it out, put it in. And probably the problem with these floppy disks, these 5 1/4, they had a little strip, the memory strip that's actually a physical media strip. If you touch it with your finger, or if you smeared it or you scratched it, it was done. Over, right? A hard little 4 1/4 discs, these little ones, smaller ones that they came out with afterwards, were a little bit more stable, but they're still able to be damaged. You could damage them with a little magnet. They're done, right? So imagine you buy a game, it lasts you for about a month, and your brother, or your mom kind of used the vacuum cleaner next to your machine, and your game is over. It's done. They're wiped out. Your discs are gone, right? We did do a little bit of online stuff at the time, but it was a lot of it. The craze happened a lot more in the States than it did in Canada back in the day. I'll tell you right now, from my remembrances, right? In Canada, we had online stuff. It was hugely expensive, and a lot of our providers didn't provide the bandwidth. Like we're talking about a modem today. When you download stuff from the internet, right? What's your baud rate at home? What's your bandwidth at home? What do you get baud rate? How much bandwidth do you get download at home? What's your download rate? Yeah. You don't know? You don't know? How much?
400 gigs.
400. But what about what's your rate? If you're going to buy, is it a 40 megabit download? A 40 megabit you pay for 40?
Right. No, sorry.
Is it 40, 25? What do you pay for at home?
Oh, sorry. 40.
30 for you? You but 40? Anyone else have a thing? What do you got at home? 25? Okay, I got 50, right? Because I just do a lot of stuff, right? And when I moved into my condo several years ago, back when we bought a condo because we were renovating, right? I had 100 back and literally 100 up and down, which is unheard of, right? Now that's because there was fiber to the condo, right? That's why I had it, right? It was like one of 2 of the condos in Toronto that allowed you to have fiber right to the home. Nowadays, Bell or Rogers will try and, or for sure Bell will try and sell you fiber to the node, which is the little box in front of your, on your lawn, right? But it's the last 100 meters that really makes a difference. If you're 100 meters as big as a copper wire, you're only going to get so much speed, right? So we were waiting for fiber to the home, which is right to the, right inside your house, right? Which is very rare. And then of course you have to have some kind of multiplexer, demultiplexer modem that converts, or switch that converts fiber into, which is light signals, into Ethernet or wireless. But anyways, back in the day, online, you had 150 baud, right? Yeah, your rate was, so you're talking about, 50 megs. We had 150, it wasn't even K. Like it was 150 bits. It was really slow, and it was dial-up. You had to call up. You had this actual modem, and your phone line, when you dialed up, was tied up. Like that's it, right? When you used your phone line, we had rotary phones back then, so you can imagine I would dial, whatever, the rotary phone, and then, that's how you normally would dial. It's a big phone, bigger than my lunchbox. That would be an average phone, right? So imagine the little modem would dial out for you. It would make DMTF tones, like the ones that go beep, boop, boop, beep, beep. These dial tones you hear today, that was a special mode. Not everyone had, dial tones, tones like this back in the day. It was pulse. Like literally, it would pulse the number. When you connected on the phone, it would pulse out, right? And then there was a revolution from pulse mode to tone mode, right? Believe it or not, there was that whole thing. Well, that affects our download rate. So online back in the day was like huge. Anyone who had it was like, what? You're online? Are you a NASA researcher? Are you a military person? Are you a university guy? Like you'd have to be something to have some kind of internet access. And there was no internet access. It was private clouds, if you will, of access. You would dial into your university and you had access to their files. Some people had access. No students, definitely not students, only professors at the time or researchers. So for you to have some kind of online game was huge. So as we moved into the 80s, we got into something called these multiplayer games, right, that you could play online. And they were called, these MUDs, multi-user dungeons, if you will. 1978, we moved into that. Still not as popular in Canada. And then finally we had the emergence of something called CompuServe, which is our first ISP ever. Not us here in Canada, but across the North America. ISPs were not even heard of. There was no internet. Back then in the time of we would call it the before the World Wide Web we're talking about, okay? So I'm in university. Think about this. I'm using a machine that's using Ultrix, all right? There is no Unix, or there's no Linux. It was just a variant of Unix. And my browser, when I first started off in university, was Netscape, right? It was just coming out. There was no CSS. There was no real ideas of HTML. It was like HTML1, like way back in the day, right? Well, this is where they started in my day, as we left the 80s and came into the 90s, where online started to go, right? Because we had the capability some people had the capability of bandwidth, right, to make it go. I'm trying to frame it for you so you understand that you guys have stuff, we all have things now that, back in the day, 30 years ago, it's undoable. You couldn't do it. So we have more capabilities now to make new kind of games that just wasn't possible before. AOL was the other big competitor. It started off in 1985, and they actually had email for home. Like that was unheard of, having email at home, right? Why would you have email at home? You have only people that had email were people at work, right? Why would you want to have email at home, right? Only executives had email at home, or something crazy like that, right? So you can imagine the first BlackBerry that came out in the 90s, right? You got to think about it, how powerful that was. That was the killer app for BlackBerry, right? BlackBerry came out, mobile phones, and it was like, literally, they're almost this big, by the way. And it was a puck. Like it looked like this, right? My numpad that I'm holding for people who are watching the video, right? And the killer app on BlackBerry was email, right? Too bad for BlackBerry now that they couldn't keep up, right? They can't keep up with iPhone and Android stuff, right? But at the end of the day, that's what it came up with. But it came around the same time. And I want to try and give you this idea of technology because technology gives us the ability to do stuff. If we have something new today, we're going to try and use that technology. An example of that today, an emerging technology today that we don't have, is a wearable device. How many people have wearable devices today in the class? Anybody? How about an Apple Watch? Right? No one has an Apple Watch. And you know what? Probably you're not going to get one. Why? For the average person, it's too expensive. It's $500 for something that's only lasts for 17 hours, right? It's $500 for something that only does a few things. That's today. But they're out. And it's something from a big company like Apple, right? And Microsoft has its HoloLens. Who knows tomorrow what it's going to be? Maybe wearables are going to just be, everyone's going to have wearables, and we're going to laugh, at people who didn't. Because we have this technology, and back in the day, you got to think of what Bill Gates was told. What? Computer in the home? Who the hell would ever want to have a computer in the home? That's ridiculous, right? Now everybody has a computer in the home. What? A cell phone? Who the hell wants a cell phone? Why would you need a cell phone, right? Now everybody has cell phones, and in parts of Europe, people have more than one cell phone. Like I know in Greece, when I go back home, people have like 2, 3 cell phones per person, right? Why? Pay as you go there is big. It's huge, right? And so they buy a cell phone, and then they buy another cell phone, and they buy another cell phone, and they just switch providers. There's 3 or 4 providers. And they just pay as you go. Big game, Quake, back in the day. But before Quake, there was Doom, right? And Doom came around the same time as Duke Nukem. Duke Nukem, Doom, all this stuff was the first kind of 3D games that came out back in the day. And it was a network game. I remember at work, it was looked down upon, but we did have like these little LAN parties. We did have that where you'd have only at work, because you had the local area network at work you could actually play, and it was like during lunchtime, and it was banned at one point. Almost like Facebook became banned at one point. When Facebook first came out, just to give you an example of parallelism, right? In 2005 or something like that, Facebook came out, something in that range, maybe a little bit earlier. No one had Facebook. They're like, "Are you on that Facebook?" Right? That's what we said. That Facebook. What is it called? Is it? Oh, it's a picture book. We couldn't remember what it was, right, back then. Now Facebook is like, everyone knows Facebook. But back then, just to give you a comparison, right? You're on Facebook at lunchtime. It's okay. People can cruise the social networks because there were no company rules against them back then. Now it's hugely looked down upon if you're at work and playing on Facebook or Twitter. Right? It's bad. You get fired for that, right? Same thing with computer games. Like playing a game like Duke Nukem or on a LAN, on the same LAN. Because remember, intrusion detection systems, the way we have them today, like actually to find out what you're doing and to monitor network traffic, that didn't exist before. So you can imagine. So network administrators wouldn't know why the hell the bandwidth is just dipping during lunch, right? Eventually they figured it out. Quake was big after Doom. I remember playing Quake for many, many, many long hours into the night, right? And it was, again, some of the first-person shooter games that ever came out. Let me just check the time, because I know I've been talking for a bit of time now. It's about an hour. So let's take a break. I think we'll stop there for mobile and handheld. As you can see how we're going. Again, we're plodding along with the history of the gaming industry. It's important to know where we came from so that we know where we're going.